The grand ballroom of the Washington Hilton gleamed under crystal chandeliers, the same ones that had witnessed history unfold beneath their light for decades. It was February 1984, and the National Prayer Breakfast had drawn its usual mix of politicians, clergy, and academics. The morning air carried the scent of coffee and fresh linen, mixed with something harder to define, the weight of expectation that comes when power and faith share the same room. President Ronald Reagan sat at the head table, his famous warmth radiating even in the formal setting. He had just finished his remarks about the role of faith in American life, his voice carrying that familiar melody of optimism that made even his critics pause. But not everyone was moved. Not everyone believed. Dr. Harrison Blackwood, a renowned philosophy professor from Georgetown University, sat 3 tables away, his sharp eyes studying the president with barely concealed disdain. He had been invited as part of the academic delegation, though everyone knew his reputation preceded him: brilliant, ruthless in debate, and famously atheistic. He had built his career dismantling what he called the comfortable myths of the powerful. As the breakfast wound down and people began to mingle, Blackwood made his move. He approached the president's table with the confidence of a man who had never lost an argument in his lecture hall. The Secret Service tensed slightly, but Reagan waved them back with that easy gesture he had perfected over the years. "Mr. President," Blackwood said, his voice carrying just loud enough for others to hear, "I must say, I find these prayer breakfasts fascinating. All these powerful people pretending to talk to someone who isn't there. It's like watching adults play with imaginary friends." The conversations around them stuttered to a stop. A few gasps escaped from nearby tables. Someone dropped a spoon, and it clattered against china like a bell tolling. Reagan's staff shifted uncomfortably, ready to intervene, but the president simply smiled, not his camera smile, but something softer, more personal. "Professor Blackwood," Reagan said, standing to shake the man's hand, "I've read your work. You write beautifully about the absence of God. Some might say that's a kind of faith all its own." Blackwood's smile sharpened. "With all due respect, Mr. President, that's the kind of semantic game politicians play, ideal in reality. And the reality is that prayer is just meditation with delusions of grandeur. You're talking to yourself and pretending the universe cares." A few people nearby shifted away, as if the conversation had become radioactive, but Reagan's expression didn't change. If anything, his eyes grew kinder, the crow's feet deepening with what looked almost like affection. "You know, Professor," Reagan began, his voice taking on that storytelling cadence that had served him since his days in Dixon, Illinois, "I used to think I understood reality pretty well too, had it all figured out. Then on March 30th, 1981, a young man named John Hinckley Jr. taught me something about the limits of human understanding." The room grew even quieter. Everyone knew the date. Everyone remembered where they were when they heard the news. The president had been shot. Blackwood's smirk faltered slightly, but he pressed on. "Are you suggesting that surviving an assassination attempt proves the existence of God?" "Mr. President, that's just probability. The bullet missed your heart by an inch. If it had been an inch to the left, we wouldn't be having this conversation. That's not divine intervention. That's ballistics." Reagan nodded slowly, as if considering this. "You're right about the inch. The doctors told me all about it. Showed me the x-rays. The bullet lodged right next to my heart. 1 inch, maybe less." He paused, his hand unconsciously moving to his chest where the scar lay hidden beneath his suit. "But that's not the part that changed me." Something in Reagan's tone made Blackwood pause. The president wasn't arguing, he was remembering. And memories, the professor knew, were harder to debate than ideas. "I was lying on that gurney," Reagan continued, "and I couldn't breathe. There's a particular kind of pain when your lung collapses, like drowning in air. The lights were so bright, and I could hear Nancy somewhere far away, though I learned later she wasn't allowed in the room yet. Strange what the mind does when it's dying. A woman at a nearby table dabbed at her eyes. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving, frozen in place like figures in a painting. The doctors were working frantically. I could see it in their eyes, that professional panic they try to hide. And I thought to myself, this is it. This is how Ronald Wilson Reagan exits the stage. No final speech, no last words of wisdom. Just a man on a table, full of someone else's bullets. Blackwood had grown very still. This wasn't the sermon he had expected. There was no preach in here, just a man sharing the weight of a moment that had almost been his last. And then, Reagan said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, the strangest thing happened. I found myself praying. Not the formal prayers I'd learned as a boy, not the ones we say at these breakfasts. Just talking, like a child. Lost in a department store, calling out for his father. He looked directly at Blackwood now, and there was something in his gaze that made the professor want to look away but couldn't. I wasn't praying to be saved, Professor. I was already making peace with going. I was praying for John Hinckley, Jr. The silence that followed was complete. Even the air seemed to pause. This confused young man who had just tried to kill me, I found myself worried about his soul, about what would happen to him, about his parents who would have to live with what their son had done. And in that moment, on that table, I felt something I can't explain with Hollywood directing or political rhetoric. I felt that held. Blackwood opened his mouth, then closed it. For perhaps the first time in his academic career, he had no ready response. The bullet didn't miss my heart by an inch, Reagan continued. It expanded my heart by miles. When I woke up after surgery, the first thing I asked about wasn't my condition or the investigation. I asked if anyone had told Hinckley's parents that I forgave their son. A Secret Service agent, a young man who had been on duty that day, turned away, his jaw tight with suppressed emotion. Now, Professor, Reagan said, his famous smile returning but gentler than before, you can call that delusion if you want. You can reduce it to neurons firing under stress, or psychological coping mechanisms, or whatever framework makes sense in your reality. But I can tell you this, in that moment between the bullet and the surgery, I wasn't talking to myself. I was held by something larger than my understanding, and it changed how I see every person in this room, including you. Blackwood stood there, his brilliant mind racing through counter-arguments, but finding each one strangely inadequate. It wasn't that Reagan had proven God existed. The professor's intellectual framework remained intact. But something else had been proven, something about the power of grace under pressure, about the choice to forgive when every instinct calls for revenge. Blackwood began, then stopped, started again. Mr. President, I came here to mock your faith. I should tell you that outright. I thought it would be easy. Another politician using religion as a prop. And now? Reagan asked, genuinely curious. Now I'm thinking about my father, Blackwood said quietly, surprising himself. He died when I was 17, lung cancer. He prayed every day of his illness. And I hated him for it, hated his hope, hated that he wasted his last words on heaven instead of on us. Reagan reached out and placed a hand on the professor's shoulder. Maybe he was talking to both. The touch was gentle, grandfatherly, and Blackwood found himself fighting an emotion he hadn't felt in years, the desire to be understood rather than to win. I gave up on God in that hospital room, Blackwood admitted. Made it my mission to help others see what I saw, that we're alone, that prayer is just whistling in the dark. And yet here you are, Reagan observed, at a prayer breakfast, arguing with a man who should be dead about whether the voice that kept him company was real. Seems to me you're still in that hospital room, Professor. Still angry at your father's God for not showing up the way you expected. Blackwood blinked hard. Around them, the breakfast was continuing, but in their small bubble, Time had slowed. He used to quote Psalms, the professor said, his voice rough. Even at the end, when he could barely speak. The Lord is close to the broken-hearted. I wanted to scream at him that if God was so close, why was his heart literally failing? Reagan's eyes grew distant, remembering. My father was an alcoholic, Jack Reagan. Good man, but he wrestled with demons that won more often than they lost. My mother, Nell, she never stopped praying for him. Never stopped believing he was more than his worst moments. I used to think her prayers were wasted breath. What changed? Blackwood asked, genuinely wanting to know. I realized her prayers weren't about changing God's mind about Jack Reagan. They were about refusing to let Jack Reagan change her mind about love. Every prayer was a choice to see the man he could be, not just the man he was. And you know what? He died sober. 5 years clean. Not because God reached down and fixed him, but because my mother's faith taught him he was worth fixing. The professor was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its edge. My father's last words were, "I'll see you again. I've spent 20 years proving he was wrong." Maybe, Reagan said gently, you've spent 20 years. Afraid he was right. Something cracked in Blackwood's expression, not his intellect, but the armor around it. I don't know how to believe in something I can't prove. Neither do I, Reagan admitted. But I know how to be grateful for that inch. I know how to forgive a young man who tried to kill me. I know how to stand here talking to you instead of debating you. That's not proof, Professor. That's just presence. And sometimes, presence is all the proof we need. The president's aide appeared at his elbow, whispering about the next appointment. Reagan nodded but didn't move yet. I have to go, he said. To Blackwood, but I want you to know something. Your father's prayers, they're still working. They brought you here, to this moment, to this conversation. You can analyze that however you want, but a man who truly believed he was alone wouldn't have come to a prayer breakfast just to prove others wrong. He'd have stayed home, content in his solitude. Blackwood watched as Reagan began to move away. Then called out, "Mr. President?" Reagan turned back. "What do you say when you pray now, after the bullet?" Reagan's smile was sunrise gentle. Usually? Thank you, for the inch. For the anger that became forgiveness. For professors who care enough to argue. And sometimes, when I'm feeling particularly grateful, I pray for the people who think they're praying alone. Because nobody is, Professor. Nobody ever has been. As Reagan walked away, surrounded by his security detail, Blackwood stood rooted to the spot. Around him the breakfast continued, conversations resuming, coffee being poured, the ordinary miracle of people gathering in something like faith. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something he hadn't looked at in years. A small card, worn soft at the edges. His father's funeral card, with Psalm 34-18 printed on the back. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. For the first time in 2 decades, Professor Harrison Blackwood didn't argue with the words. He just held them, standing in a room full of people talking to someone he wasn't sure existed, and found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, someone was listening after all. Later that evening, the professor sat in his study, surrounded by books that had built his reputation as faith's most formidable opponent. But tonight, they felt different. Less like weapons, more like questions. He opened his laptop and began to type. Not another paper dismantling belief, but a letter. It was addressed to his graduate students, the ones who hung on his every skeptical word. Today, he wrote, I met a man who was shot in the chest and chose to pray for his shooter. He didn't try to convert me. He didn't need to. He simply showed me that faith isn't about being right. It's about being human. And perhaps that's a kind of proof after all. He paused, then added, we'll be discussing this in next week's seminar. Come prepared to argue. But also, perhaps, come prepared to listen. Across town, in the White House residence, Reagan sat with Nancy, telling her about his day. When he got to the part about Professor Blackwood, she squeezed his hand. "Do you think you changed his mind?" she asked. Reagan shook his head. "I don't think that was my job. I just told him about the bullet and the inch. The rest is between him and whoever he's been arguing with all these years." "You mean God?" "Maybe," Reagan said, his eyes twinkling. "Or maybe just his father. Sometimes they're harder to forgive than the divine." As the night settled over Washington, two men in different parts of the city did something neither had expected when the day began. They prayed. One with practiced ease, grateful for another day, another chance to show grace. The other hesitantly, angrily even, but for the first time in 20 years, admitting there might be someone to be angry at. And somewhere between belief and doubt, in that inch between the bullet and the heart, grace found room to work. The story of that prayer breakfast spread, as such stories do. Not through headlines or news cycles, but through quieter channels. A senator telling his wife, a waiter sharing with his congregation, a Secret Service agent finally explaining to his daughter why he sometimes touched his chest when he thought. No one was looking. Professor Blackwood never became a believer in the traditional sense. But he stopped trying to disprove what he couldn't understand. His classes changed too. Where once he had taught certainty, he now taught questions. Where once he had demanded proof, he now allowed for mystery. And every year, on March 30th, he would remember an inch, a prayer. A president who forgave before he knew if he would survive. Some would call it coincidence. Others would call it grace. Blackwood had learned to call it both, and to be grateful for the difference he could no longer define. Years later, when Reagan's mind began to fade, when Alzheimer's stole his words and his memories, Nancy would tell people about the things that remained. His kindness, his humor, and strangely, his clarity about forgiveness. "He might not remember your name," she would say, "but he remembers to pray for the young man with the gun every night." Even now, Professor Blackwood heard this at Reagan's funeral. He stood in the rain with thousands of others, watching a flag-draped casket carry away the man who had changed his mind about changing minds. And for the first time since his father's death, Harrison Blackwood prayed in public. Not loudly, not demonstratively. Just a whisper in the rain. "Thank you for the inch, for the argument, for the grace to see that some things are worth believing, even when we can't prove them. And if anyone's listening, tell them both, the president and my father, that I finally understand. Faith isn't about being sure. It's about being willing to speak into the silence and trust that love echoes back." The rain continued to fall, but Blackwood didn't move. He stood there, a professor of doubt who had learned the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes the greatest wisdom is admitting what we don't know, and the greatest courage is praying anyway. And in that inch between skepticism and faith, between a bullet and a heart, between a father's death and a president's forgiveness, he had found something he never expected. Room to breathe, room to grieve, room to believe that maybe, just maybe, no one prays alone. The prayer breakfast ended, but its ripples continued. In classrooms where doubt met faith with respect instead of ridicule. In hospital rooms where the dying were met with presence instead of platitudes. In 1,000 quiet moments where people remembered that grace isn't proved, it's practiced. And in the end, that was Reagan's greatest sermon. Not words from a podium, but a life that showed forgiveness is stronger than bullets. That prayer changes the one who prays even when it can't change the outcome. And that sometimes the most powerful testimony is simply refusing to hate the one who tried to. End your story. The inch that saved Reagan's life became miles of grace in the lives of others. And Professor Harrison Blackwood, who had come to mock, left having learned the hardest truth of all. We are never as alone as we think we are, not when we doubt, not when we believe, and especially not in that sacred inch between the two, where grace does its finest work.